Hi, Jason. Thanks for joining me for coffee today.
Oh, Richellle, my pleasure.
I really want to know more about seminar classes and teaching seminars. I was thinking about some of the practices that I use, and I really like gathering information from other instructors about what they do in their classes and what would make a seminar effective, not effective, what makes a seminar different than a lecture, that kind of stuff. So somebody pointed me your direction.
I love talking about what we do in the classroom, whether it's seminars or anything else. I think there's so much to be gained from talking to other people about their practices. I guess I would maybe wonder, like, how many of your courses that you teach are what you call seminar style?
I would call 100% of my classes are seminar style.
Yeah.
We run pretty small classes in the Faculty of Ed, so at most I've taught 42 in a class, and I would still call that seminar. That's just how I operate. I don't know if that's from being a high school teacher before, or I don't know where that comes from, but I would say all of what I do is a seminar.
Yeah, I mean, I think of my own teaching practice in similar terms, but I have classes bigger than the 42. I've taught in this very room and tried to teach it, with a seminar idea in mind at least. So I regularly do that in classes of 80, even 40. I mean, I love doing it in classes of 25 or 20 or 15, or even smaller than that. But I'm with you. I love teaching that way. What is it that shapes that decision for you? Why do you like teaching that way so much?
I really draw on cooperative learning strategies and collaborative learning strategies in a classroom, and I think that students have a lot to learn from each other, as well as me, so I like to get them talking about their ideas so that I know when to, maybe I know when to jump in, so that I jump in and jump out of the conversation so it's not focused around me so much, but that they're, particularly because our classes are about teaching and assessment and mathematics, and so having students share their ideas really gets the conversation bigger. And I have several practices that I like to use where I get the majority of my students at least talking in class. Otherwise, I find sometimes there's some students that don't say a thing all class.
Yeah.
And I've learned from teaching high school that there are some students that wouldn't say a thing all day in school, and they would never be heard, or their ideas would never be heard. So I try and incorporate those kinds of things in all of my classes. And I would love to teach like an 80 to 100 person class and see what that would be like.
Yeah.
See if I could still like draw that out of students.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. That's when you really get to see, what do you really understand, right? It's all well and good if for me personally, if I'm lecturing, I have a little trouble getting a sense, like, you can read somebody's body language or something, like I think they're with me. But then when you get them, like when they're saying it in their own words, you're like, oh, you get it. You're right there. And maybe you said it in a way that made sense for somebody else, in a way that I couldn't have expressed. So I love hearing them express and articulate the ideas.
So what drew you to that kind of teaching?
I think that's the kind of classroom that I enjoyed. I think I struggled a little bit in classrooms where I was just supposed to take, good lectures I think are fabulous. But for me personally as a learner, I really needed to be, okay, I want to try and say this and see, it made sense when you said it, but is it going to make sense when I say it? And so as a student, I really wanted that, and so I really look for ways to do that with my students. And I think that in the bigger classes especially, that's important, because in the smaller classes, you can just get more one-on-one time and get a sense, like, where are you at? How can I help you get to the next place or whatever? But in those larger rooms, I really need to hear them express the ideas, because I don't want it to just be a surprise to them or to me at an exam, like, oh, actually, I had no idea what that idea meant because I'd only heard you say it. And I memorized it in those words, and I would, my questions on an exam wouldn't be, regurgitate my words back to me. They'd be like, do you get this? Do you understand it? So I really need them to have opportunities to test that out in the classroom. And with each other is really important, like you said, right? I'll really encourage them to do that, because the way they'll express it for and with each other is going to help them understand it differently than just listening to me say it. Because I'm going to say things, of course, and explain them in a particular way. So they get multiple explanations that way, and we get a chance to go, okay, what did you like about that explanation? How could we tweak it? How could we move it over here?
Right.
Yeah.
And I really like to have students put their ideas down, not necessarily on paper, but on boards. That's why I like teaching in the scale-up classroom, is because I get them in groups and on the whiteboards. And by the time our class is finished, the boards are full, and I've probably written 5 words. And they have pulled the ideas together and put them up there in either a visual representation or schematically, or however they best see fit. And then that way, then we get students to look at each other's work and others' ideas, and then they come back together and say, okay, what did I pull out from each of these? What surprised me from each of these that everybody else wrote? And I think that really helps and clarify for me, like you said, what are they pulling out that I might need to highlight for them to make sure that this is something that's really important that they get, or what might they have pulled out that I just am like, I never saw that before, that is so cool. And I've had so many of those experiences with like, that's a great way to think about that. I like the way you framed that, and it helps me think about it in a different way, and then of course I steal that and use it in my teaching next semester.
That's right. That's right. And claim it as your own.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, I say that most of what I do is not my own. I've stolen it from somebody else. So
that's right. Why wouldn't we do that though?
Well, I agree.
Why wouldn't we adopt people's best ideas and shape them and give them credit, of course? But
yeah,
I mean, that's part of the project for me, is to figure out like how can we build each other's, you know, repertoires in that way.
And it's not like I'm taking yours and you don't have it anymore.
Right.
It's like we're sharing these and we're growing them together. And it's funny when people say, well, I'm going to steal that idea, and they're like guilty of it. I'm like, go ahead, please. Like I took it from somebody else. Just it's professional learning in, I guess, for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's one of the things that I love about getting to have conversations like this, is we're not often encouraged to talk to each other about our teaching, like in specific ways.
Right.
And so, you know, the chance to do so with other folks who care deeply about this stuff and have tried their own stuff. Like I haven't used I've taught in that scale up room as well, and I haven't used the whiteboards to full effect, and just hearing you describe it makes me want to try it when I'm in there, you know, this next time. Think about, you know, how I can have them do that, because it, you know, it gives them another way to express their ideas and to illustrate them for each other, and to have that resource available at the end of the day to say, you know, look what we just accomplished together.
And then of course I take pictures of it, and then I post it on Moodle afterwards, and then they've got those images for later. And I will find that students will take pictures of the things that, you know, around the room. And what I find fascinating later too is there's some sort of positional memory that we have when we go back in the room the next class and say, remember what we wrote over here?
Right.
And students can bring forward that the thinking that was on the board there, that image. Remember when they drew the image of the eye, and what does, you know, and so pulling that all back together, I think helps them make the connections across topics that we do between the classes. And so sometimes I don't do that very effectively, but other times I think we get a good sense from between classes and across classes, what we're trying to get across overall is a big arching picture. And that's kind of, I guess, where my focus is too, is what is the big picture I want them to bring out of this class? And if I can help them tie that together, then.
Yeah. You talked a lot about collaborative learning. So how do you go about making those collaborative spaces?
So that's a really good question. In a classroom like H177, the scale up classroom, that's easy to do. They're set up in collaborative spaces already. I insist that, or I put in practices where students have to roll a die, and each student rolls a die and answers a question according to the number that they roll. So every student has an opportunity to talk. Or I say, every one of you at the table has to fill out this portion of the sheet. Now we're going to mix you up, and now you're going to help each other fill out the separate portions of the sheet, or stuff like that, so that it's like jigsaw is what the one activity is called, where you have the expert groups and then they go into mixed groups and then back to expert groups. That's what I use popsicle sticks for. Colored popsicle sticks and cards are my favorite things in the world to use in a classroom for grouping and regrouping students.
Like playing cards?
Playing cards.
Okay.
Depending on how many students I have and how many groups I need and how many people I want in a group, I will use either one of those. So I would say with playing cards, coordinate or group together by suit.
Right.
Or now let's coordinate by number, or by face value, or let's coordinate all the odd numbers together and all the even numbers together, or however I want to do it, or all the black cards and all the red cards. So it just really depends on what my goal is for the class that day.
Right.
So what I've found, or what some of my colleagues have found actually, is that when you're getting students working in groups on boards, is that group of 3 is great. Group of 4 is too many, a group of 2 just isn't enough. But when you're in a classroom with only 5 whiteboards and you've got 30 students, how do you make a group of 3? So, you know, you try and manage the groups that way. Also depends on math and some divisibility rules and how many students you have in class and all that. And I often will put in a joker in there if I'm using cards and say, well, whoever has the joker can pick whatever group, because we didn't make an even number of groups. Anyway,
right.
It's kind of fun that way. But I try and put the structures embedded in the class so that they can't hide. They can't be the one that sits back. And some students are really uncomfortable with that because they've gotten through by hiding, by sitting in the back and not talking.
And so you mix the groups up frequently throughout the semester, so they don't end up just working with the same groups repeatedly?
No, they will mix up probably 4 times in a class. And we have 3-hour blocks. So think about it in a 3-hour block. I really have 3 separate things that are happening in there. And so they will mix up quite a bit. And students will come in the first class and they'll have their water bottle and they'll have their coffee cup and they'll have their snack, they'll have their laptop, they'll have their bag. They'll set up a little camp around them.
Yeah,
I see you. You've seen that, right? And I'll say, okay, put your camp away, pack up your stools, pack up your little tent. You're gonna move a lot in this class. You may wanna put your bags against the wall because they'll get trampled on or whatever. And so they get used to not setting up camp. And then they will get used to not sitting with the same people all the time as well. And if they do, they'll get moved. Sometimes as they come in, I give them the popsicle sticker card and they know they have to sit with that group. Or I'll give it to them later in the class or whatever. I have had students say that they're tired of it, that they just want to sit one class. And I tell them, no, that's not what we do.
What you signed up
That's
for.
not what we do here. So suck it up for a little bit. But I get sometimes it's tiring for them when they're used to sitting and absorbing. Now they have to produce and they have to move and they have to think. And sometimes it's hard for them.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important.
I like there are a number of things in there that I like, but the mixing up of the groups, one of the ways that I've done it is I have name cards in the first couple of weeks, so I'm really trying to learn their names, but I'll use those name cards to sort of set up places because I kind of know who likes to sit together and I'll try to mix them up frequently. And then a few weeks into class, I'll do kind of informal feedback, like one thing you want me to keep doing, start doing, stop doing.
I do that exactly a couple of weeks in.
It's magic.
It is.
And one of the things that I heard this last semester was like, keep mixing us up. You so often get that resistance, but then I had a couple of students that were like, keep having us sit with different groups. It's so generative, it's so productive. So I'll sometimes do, if I've got them in 6 groups or something in AH 177, then I'll say, okay, so we're gonna do this for 15 minutes. And then I want 2 people, right, from this group to slide to that group and so on. Take your ideas from that group, take the paper that you were writing notes on or whatever to that group and then make the case for why you chose these particular elements to focus on or whatever. And so you get some sort of coherence from one group to the next, but you've put sort of 2 different halves together and it's like bringing those 2 conversations together, right? So that it doesn't always have to come back to, okay, let's talk about this as a group of 20, which is productive.
Right.
But then create space again where it can become just 2 or 3 voices in that group of 20. Whereas keep that group going, then you've just got much more space for those students. I mean, in part it's about hiding, and in part I think just some students are more comfortable talking to 2 or 4 folks than talking to 20, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I have a hard time managing that group of 20 conversation after the fact and getting a nice variety of voices while still honoring the conversations that happen at the tables and within that small groups. I like the idea of moving 2 people at a time and so that they're not solo. And I'm rethinking that most of the times my groups are, a group of 6 and now they all spread out. So they don't have that somebody with them to help them defend what they're saying. And so I think moving a pair at a time is a good idea.
Well, and if you have it clear from the outset, like these are the 2 people that are going to be moving, you'll watch them sort of looking at each other like, do we know what we're going to say when we go to the next day? Like, are we on the same page here? So I think it can work really well.
And I haven't set them up beforehand. I surprise it on them and say, okay, you guys are the spokespeople, and they don't have a chance to do that.
Yeah.
And so I think that might be a nice way so that those that aren't comfortable necessarily off the cuff, that they have a chance to frame their thinking before they make that move. No, I like that. That's nice.
One of my favorite parts of having group work like that is just wandering around the room and just listening to the conversations and maybe participating, but I try not to.
Yeah.
Often if I interject, it's to say, that's a really great point. I really want you to bring that up when we bring it back to the big group. Yeah. And so again, they've got time to figure out who's going to be comfortable saying that or whatever, and it just feels hopefully less like I'm putting them on the spot when we are talking about it in the big group. And I say, well, let's connect these 2 ideas. I heard at this group they were talking about such and such. Can somebody elaborate on that for me? And it's just, it's really cool to watch them make the connections themselves because, if you do that enough, they start, instead of sort of going through you, they're like, okay, you're here and that's fine, you're facilitating, but I really want to talk to this person because they made that point. And I just get to sit back and go, my work here is done. I mean, in that moment at least. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating because when I talk to pre-service teachers about teaching, they'll run a class like that in their grade 6 classroom and they'll say, but I'm not teaching much today. I'm like, no, you're facilitating some amazing learning. It's not about what you're doing. And so you're right, it's not about you controlling the conversation, which you can't do anyway, but helping them make those connections across and in between. I've heard some really amazing, experienced teachers say to me, I'm not teaching a lot today. Like, well, let's see what they're learning. And it's really about what are they learning through doing that experience.
Right.
I really think it's important for them, like you said, not to have to go through you always. Though sometimes I feel like if they're going a little bit sideways, I need to pull them back a little bit, but you know, why not? It doesn't have to be all about me.
No, I mean, I'm sure it was not intended as a compliment, but one of my course evaluations in an early seminar was, this guy didn't teach us anything. He made us teach ourselves. And I was like, spot on, you nailed it, right? I think my job is to I wouldn't even say set limits at all, but to sort of say, okay, there's some territory I want to make sure we cover. And so if there's a connection to be made, I can maybe help point that out or something like that. But it's much more, as you said, facilitating, right? And if there's a moment where we need to stop and go, okay, we need to understand this idea a little bit better before we can move on in the conversation, fine, then we can stop and do that.
Right.
But in general, I want to let them sort of scope out the parameters and just make sure that we get to where we need to get, along with some really, hopefully provocative new directions that they're going to take it that I hadn't thought of, as you said earlier, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the beauty of it.
One of the challenges I have is the dissenting opinions. And I deal with classroom assessment, and there's really deep set beliefs about classroom assessment and what the purposes are and why we should do certain things. And when I have these dissenting opinions in class, I have a hard time managing and honoring both opinions when I'm not positive that they're both necessarily foundationally correct.
Yeah.
So that is one place where I'm like, okay, now I don't know what to do with this over here.
Yeah.
So I don't know, have you had things like that come up in your class?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the times that I try to get students to do some of the work for me. Let's talk about these different ways of approaching this idea or whatever, and then they can, so instead of me coming in and correcting,
right.
which is overstating it, of course.
Yeah.
But instead of me coming in and sort of saying, no, we need to fix this problem here, the students can do some of that, and often even in the context of that, because it's a lower pressure sort of moment.
Right.
The student who expressed the idea in the first place, yeah, maybe I didn't say that quite the way that I wanted to, or something like that. And so it's a moment where we can clarify. But that's an ideal scenario. It doesn't always go that way, of course.
Right. I like that, though, putting it back to the group and saying, well, let's talk about this. Let's see where this is coming from. For us, it's a lot of their foundations, and they're thinking about what is the purpose of schooling in general. Why are we even going through school? Well, is it to train them to be a good worker? Is it to, what is this really about? Until you can get down to some of that deeper level, then we start thinking, oh, now that makes sense why you would say, yes, take 10% off per day late of any assignment.
Right.
That completely makes sense.
Yeah.
But sometimes we don't have the time to get to that deeper level of the thinking in the class.
Yeah.
So.
But I mean, whether it's that or even something like a classroom agreement, I really want the students doing it, right? Not me doing it. And it was an idea that somebody gave me kind of early on, and I was like, oh yeah, why am I saying this is how this has to work in this classroom? Let them say it. And I've always done that. So day one, right?
Yeah.
This is super, super important for me because we end up talking about difficult stuff: race, gender, class, sexuality, whatever.
Yeah.
And so I really want that to happen on day one. Like, let's be clear what this has to look like, how this space needs to work. And I've always sort of thought, if somebody doesn't say one of the things that I really want on there, I'm going to make sure it gets said anyway.
Right.
And I've never had to do it.
Nice.
They want the same sorts of respect and boundaries and whatever in the classroom as we do. So just giving them a moment to do that and articulate it also makes it easier for me on the very rare occasion that later in the course I need to go, okay, hold on, let's think back to the to the classroom agreement that you helped construct day one. And this is one of the things that we said was foundational. And I think we're messing with it a little bit right now, right? It just, there's a different kind of ownership, I think.
I don't even know what kinds of classes you teach.
I mean, everything from intro sociology, which would be in a classroom like this,
Yep.
To methods classes, so qualitative research methods, for
Nice.
example, sociology of risk, kind of substantive seminars. So, I mean, a variety, but I think a lot of the courses that I teach, one of the things that I've thought about, I mean, especially at the 2,000 and 3,000 level, second and third year level, second especially, we get a lot of students taking it who are not sociology majors,
Right.
and think it's something maybe quite different than what it is, right? So one of the most difficult courses to teach in certain ways for me is one called Deviance, Conformity, and Social Control. And you get
It
students.
sounds fantastic.
It's got a super sexy title, and so
totally.
it draws people in. And then people are like, okay, so you're going to tell us how to diagnose the deviants and fix them. And I was like, oh, back up, right? So to your point of like, let's let's have a foundational moment here. Let's clarify what the project is, right? And so that's a moment where depending on the point in the course, I'll draw on other students to the extent possible. And there's inevitably, you're going to have, and that's a class of 80 students.
Okay.
So if I've got 2 or 3 in there who can articulate, who can get us part way to why we're not going to take that approach, then I can just, and building on that, make this other connection over here. So whatever the course, for me, that day one accomplishes so many things, right? I try to introduce like one of the central ideas that'll run through the course, and I try to do it in a really memorable way, whether that's performative or whether that's a group exercise or whatever it is, so that we can come back to it throughout the course. But also to orient students, like if you think this course is about this, here's your moment to know that it's what you were saying earlier about moving, right? Yeah. If you're signing up for this course, this is what it's going to look like, or this is what it's about in this case. It's not about, fixing the deviance. It's about figuring out like how do we construct particular ideas about what constitutes deviance, right? That can be a challenging idea for students to wrap their head around if they've come in like, okay, here's what we're doing. But that's why day one is so that moment for me. So I never, ever, ever go through a course outline on day one.
Yeah.
I don't actually go through it line by line ever. I just don't think there's a value to it. But I don't give it to them. I won't even hand it to them until like 35, 40 minutes into class. That whole time is about like setting a classroom environment, getting them hooked, introducing a big idea, even if we don't identify it as such in that moment. And then, okay, here's what the course actually looks like. Here's sort of the day-to-day stuff. But what I really want you focusing on is what we did at first, right? Hearing your own voices, talking to each other. It's this idea that's going to run through the course, whatever it is. The course outline is almost an afterthought for me. Yeah. And it's funny because students are like, Nancy, like, where's the course outline? I need to know when the exams are.
And that's exactly why they need to know the course outline. The same thing, it's, for me, again, with 3-hour classes, it'll be the last 45 minutes that it's like, okay, now here's the course outline finally. And then they flip to what the assignments are. I'm like, so why don't I just give you the assignment page? Why do I even have this preamble, whatever, that's about this course? But you're right, it's that front end, laying out the course, laying out the expectations of participation, engagement with the ideas. Yeah. Now what's interesting is the majority of the courses I teach are required courses, and the students don't get an option of who they take the course from. And I just started thinking about this in the last year or so. They get their schedule, they get their instructors. They can't move from instructor to instructor. They can't drop the course. This is what it is, this is what you've got. And so I think some of them maybe feel stuck in a course or with an instructor that doesn't meet either their expectations or their learning style or whatever. So it's really interesting to think about students that can drop in and out, and once they know, whoa, this is not what I signed up for, I can get out. Yeah. These students can't.
I teach almost nothing in almost every case, students will have some element of choice, right? Whether it's to take it with a different instructor or to take a different course or whatever. So there's a lot of shopping in those first days.
Yeah.
And for me, that's an important moment to signal, like, this is going to be work of this kind. And if that's not what you want, that's great. Go take this other section or whatever. But yeah, I'm not sure how I would deal with them being locked in those ways.
And I don't know how I deal with them having an option. All of a sudden I have an empty classroom. All right, well, that was fun. Thanks. I just think it's so fascinating. And it's not something that I had actually thought about before until somebody said, oh yeah, my students can drop or move to another section. I'm like, whoa, our students can't. They just can't. Like, this is who they have. Yeah. Good luck, kind of thing. And so, I wonder about then the dynamics of the class.
Yeah, the dynamics at the 4,000 level, for example, generally are pretty awesome because, students know us by that point. Right. So I'm teaching a 4,000 level seminar in the fall, and as I look through my course list, I know almost every name already. So they know who they're signing up with in that way, right? And they do have choice in those ways. So yeah, it would be. I'm not sure what I would do in the absence of that.
Well, I do the mwahaha thing right at the very beginning too, and they all look at me horrified, and we get past it. Yeah. So.
Intro is a different beast, for example, to go to the very opposite end of the spectrum, right? You walk into here, and I'll see 250 faces or 300 faces and not recognize one of them. Right. But there's also kind of magic to that. And again, not just, it's not specific to it being a big lecture. I still want them talking to each other and bringing in elements of that sort of seminar learning. Right. It's just tougher to do in a classroom like this, for example, where you've got these fixed desks, right? The chairs can move, but not very far. So mixing up the groups, for example, is almost unthinkable. Right. Right. If I were to do that in a meaningful way, there go 50 minutes. Yeah. You've gone like, okay, now that you're in new groups, see you Wednesday.
Yeah. Right. Remember this group and where you sat.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I do love teaching in rooms that have movable tables and chairs, like in ways that actually make that not an aberration, right? B660, for example, that those sort of deep ones that 80 students, and to try and get them doing group work, or I get them even doing mini seminars, so there will be like 6 seminars going on at the same time in that room, and they're just maybe 20 or 30 feet apart from one another, and I'm trying to listen in on all the conversations, and I'm jumping over desks. But it's that important to me to get them doing that I'm willing to do that, and they go with me because I'm like, this is the deal. This is the space we've got, and we want to make it work this way. So they get into it, but at first they're like, "We're doing what?"
Yeah. So what I found I get students to do some mini lessons with each other, and again, I can't do it in the space we've got, so I use the rooms up in the library quite a bit, and they've got the little tiny rooms that can fit like 6 people in, and then they've got a few bigger rooms, and I get students to book those, and I say we meet up there, and then I'm like the peeping Tom. I'm running around peeking in the windows as they're doing their lessons, or sneaking in the door, shutting the door, and sneaking out. So that to me has been really fun to get them to see how they interact. And often they don't know I'm peeking at them when I'm peeking at them, and I can actually hear through the door what they're saying most times. So that's been a fun way to just utilize a different space. And it gets them into a different kind of mode, I guess, as well. And then again, I move them all around, but you just have to be careful that you're not too noisy or whatever.
I mean, that's been one of the big challenges, I suppose, in recent years for me with bigger classrooms is figure out, like, how do I still get those collaborative learning moments in there? How do I make sure that they've got the basic, the sort of foundational knowledge that they need to do that? But then how do I create the space where they can actually share that for each other? And finding ways to do that in the classroom, but also, I mean, and I think it was Doug Orr in the Teaching Center who came up with this idea for me, getting them to write exams in groups. So doing a pyramid exam where they write an exam individually, but they write it in groups. And at first I was like, oh, I don't know, because I didn't do that as a student. So I was, oh, that sounds scary. But then watching them do it, and they're teaching each other during an exam, right? They're actually explaining ideas and debating, like, why would we want to answer it this way? And I just get to wander around and listen, and I'll help where I need to or whatever. But to have students come out of an exam, I'm like, I learned so much from my classmates in the last 75 minutes, and they're laughing, they're joking while they're doing it, because we've set it up that they know there's value in it, but it's also not a super pressure cooker like a one-person exam sometimes feels. And so they come out and they're like, that was the coolest exam I've ever taken, and I never thought I would say a sentence like that. Okay, awesome. That was the idea.
Well, and that too, you have to frame your exams differently then, right? They can't be recall kinds of questions. They have to be really in-depth conversation kinds of questions. And that's what I want my students to engage in, is that conversation. And like the debate that can happen, I think is fantastic. I have teachers that will say, oh, well, then they're cheating off each other.
No, they're learning together.
Yeah. And that's, I don't know, I think that's kind of the point.
That's how I sell it, because I mean, students hear about this and they're like, no, there's no part of that I'm okay with. And I'm like, listen, this is how it works. And so I make sure, what they want to know is how does it work marks-wise, right? They want to know in practical levels. And so once I've convinced them, like, everybody's mark is going to benefit from this, and it's going to benefit by exactly the same amount. Once I've convinced them of that, I say, and the real reason for doing it is that the students who understand the material the best are going to understand it better because they're helping the others understand it. And the students who have had a little bit of trouble understanding a concept are going to understand it better because they've heard an explanation that's different from mine, from one of their classmates. And so everybody benefits. If you buy in, everybody benefits. And I can think of one student over 6 or 7 years of doing this that's clearly been like, nope, I want no part of this the whole time.
So funny.
Yeah, and fine. But everybody else is like, wow, that was, I never thought an exam could do that.
Very cool.
And it's not like I'm jonesing to do exams, but in situations where I've got 250 students and I've got some sort of limits in terms of, okay, I might have to do this. Still finding ways to bring in that sort of seminar element that I think too often waits until the 4th year or something.
So it's working within the constraints you've got creatively.
Trying to anyway.
That's awesome.
But I still need to figure out in this room, for example, and there are some people who have recently been doing some work on this, so I need to talk to them about it. But in this room, how do I get more collaborative learning and more collaborative learning that has full value to it? That's maybe my big question that's outstanding still.
Love it.
Okay.